How would you feel if everything around you suddenly went dark? When you stand in a seemingly peaceful neighborhood and can't explain why all the lights went out. I remember that moment clearly. It was a Friday evening when all the lights in the Brook Ridge Summit neighborhood suddenly went out. I was in my garage, halfway through tightening a bolt on my lawn mower engine, when the wrench slipped from my hand. Just as the overhead fluorescent lights flickered and died, I thought it was just a breaker, something local. But when I stepped out onto the driveway, everything was different. All the houses were in complete darkness, not a single light was on. As I looked across the street, I saw my neighbors emerging as well, each holding flashlights. The flashlight beams darted across the houses, and the streetlights stayed cold. The entire block was dark, and it wasn't just for a minute. Something was wrong. My name is Tom Granger. I'm 62 years old, retired after 30 years as a fire marshal. I thought my retirement would be quiet, just mowing lawns, watching Braves games, and fixing whatever broke on my property. I never expected I'd have to deal with a fight like this, a neighborhood blackout, not caused by a storm or an accident, but by the very people who were supposed to protect us, the HOA. Brook Ridge Summit, a quiet, tree-lined community, seemed peaceful on the surface. But peace here was maintained by rules, fines, and the iron grip of a board that believed they owned our lives. Recently, they had grown bolder. We'd all noticed it. More fines for aesthetic violations, passive-aggressive newsletters, sudden board meetings that no one could attend. But this blackout felt different. It was deliberate, calculated, and frightening. I grabbed a flashlight in one hand and my phone in the other. The cell signal was patchy, ironically, considering the HOA had recently opposed a cell tower proposal because it would ruin the skyline. A group of us gathered in front of the Simons house. There was Ed, a Navy vet with a gruff voice, Maria, who ran the neighborhood daycare, and Ellie, who took care of her bedridden mother across the street from me. "Your lights out too?" Maria asked, cradling a shivering toddler against her shoulder. "Yeah," I nodded. "Whole street's dead. I called Georgia Power," Ed grumbled. "They say no outage reported. The grid's fine." Then we all looked at each other, then back toward the darkened homes. The eerie silence was broken only by a dog barking in the distance. The sense of helplessness was suffocating. It was the kind of stillness you learn to fear when you've seen enough emergencies. That night, I slept with a battery-powered lantern beside my bed and a fire extinguisher near the door. Old habits die hard. I woke up every hour to check the temperature. It had dropped to the low 40s. Ellie's mother needed electric heating for her arthritis. Maria's baby monitor wouldn't work without Wi-Fi. I imagined how quickly things could spiral out of control. By morning, we still had no power and no explanation. The HOA hadn't sent a warning, no emails, no notices on the community board. Not even a flyer slipped under the door. And this was the same HOA that once fined me $50 for leaving my garbage can visible for 8 hours after collection. I decided it was time to pay the HOA office a visit. The tan stucco building near the clubhouse seemed like the last place someone would expect to find answers on a Saturday. But to my surprise, the lights were on inside, powered by a backup generator, of course. Karen Langston, the HOA president, was sitting behind her desk, sipping a latte like nothing was wrong. She raised an eyebrow when I entered. "Tom," she said flatly, "to what do I owe the visit?" "I'm here about the power, Karen," I replied, my voice calm but clipped. "The whole block is out, and Georgia Power says there's no issue." "So what happened?" She looked up slowly, as though deciding whether I deserved the truth. Then, like a queen granting mercy to a peasant, she leaned back in her chair and said, "The board voted to cut temporary power to delinquent properties until assessments are paid. It's not permanent, just a reminder." I blinked. "You're telling me you shut off utilities to families without notice in the winter?" "Let's not exaggerate," she replied coolly. "It's not families, it's 6 properties, all behind on their HOA dues. Yours included, I believe. I missed one payment," I said, jaw tightening, "by 3 days. And I called to explain." Karen waved a manicured hand. "It's a policy decision. We're within our rights." "No," I said slowly, "you're not." She gave me a thin smile. "Well, if you feel otherwise, you're free to take it up with the board at the next hearing." I left without another word. There was no point arguing with someone who thought empathy was a weakness. But inside, something had shifted. A fuse had been lit. Because Karen didn't just cut off our power, she severed something much deeper. Our trust. We thought we were living in a community. But it turns out we were just pawns in a power game controlled by people who didn't understand compassion. When the power was still out the next morning, I realized I couldn't just sit and wait anymore. Our neighborhood, which I had always trusted, was now shrouded in silence and darkness. The streetlights remained off, and no one knew what was happening. Furthermore, no notice had been given by the HOA. I picked up my phone and called Georgia Power, only to be told that there was no outage reported in our area. They said the grid was fine. This made me more frustrated than ever. What had the HOA done to us? Didn't they realize that there were families living in dangerous conditions? Ellie, the elderly woman next door, needed electricity for her oxygen machine. Maria had a young child and couldn't let them suffer in the cold. The whole neighborhood seemed to be suffocating under a sense of dread. I couldn't just stand there. I decided to go directly to the HOA office to get some answers. The tan stucco building near the clubhouse was the last place I thought I'd find anything resembling an explanation on a Saturday, but when I arrived, the lights were on, powered by a backup generator, of course. Karen Langston, the HOA president, was sitting at her desk, sipping a latte like everything was normal. She raised an eyebrow when I walked in. "Tom," she said, flatly, "what brings you here?" "I'm here about the power, Karen," I replied, my voice calm but firm. "The whole block is out, and Georgia Power says there's no issue. So what's going on?" Karen looked up slowly, as if deciding whether or not I deserved the truth. Then, like a queen granting mercy to a peasant, she leaned back in her chair and said, "The board voted to cut temporary power to delinquent properties until assessments are paid. It's not permanent. Just a reminder." I was stunned. "You're telling me you shut off utilities to families without notice in the winter?" "Let's not exaggerate," she said coolly. "It's not families, it's 6 properties, all behind on their HOA dues. Yours included, I believe." "I missed one payment," I said, my jaw tightening, "by 3 days. And I called to explain." Karen waved a manicured hand dismissively. "It's a policy decision. We're within our rights." "No," I said slowly, "you're not." She gave me a thin, almost smug smile. "Well, if you feel otherwise, you're free to take it up with the board at the next hearing." I left without saying another word. There was no point in arguing with someone who thought empathy was a weakness. But as I walked away, something inside me had shifted. A fuse had been lit. Because Karen didn't just cut off our power, as night fell, an eerie silence enveloped the entire neighborhood. Everything was dark, with not a single light on, except for the weak flashlight beams of the worried families. The feeling I had at that moment was like a nightmare. The peaceful neighborhood I had called home for so many years was now filled with fear. I could feel the anxiety in the eyes of those around me. People were not only worried about the cold, but also about their safety in the dark. Ellie, a mother who took care of her elderly mother on oxygen, was one of the most concerned. With the power still cut, her mother's oxygen machine was running out of battery. I went to check on them, and the tension in the air was palpable. Maria, another friend and a mother of young children, couldn't let her kids suffer in the cold throughout the night. No one in the neighborhood could sleep peacefully, not knowing when the power would return or who might be in danger first. Fear wasn't something I had felt for the first time in my life. After over 30 years in fire service, I had witnessed countless disasters, but nothing made me feel as helpless as this. I had always been the person they turned to during emergencies, but now, I couldn't help anyone. Everyone was waiting for help from the HOA, but instead of getting the support they needed, they were left in the cold with no notice. I decided to walk door to door, checking on the neighbors. Ed, an old friend, sat by himself on the porch, his arms crossed, staring at the dark houses. Even though he was usually quiet and reserved, today I could see the concern in his eyes. "There's no power," Ed said, his voice low. "Honestly, I don't know what to do anymore." Looking around, I saw Maria wrapping her toddler in towels, trying to keep the baby warm. The cold was becoming a real threat, and I was beginning to worry how quickly things could spiral out of control if the power didn't come back soon. Everyone in the neighborhood was silent. No one spoke, but I could feel the weight of the fear pressing down on all of us. This silence wasn't something new to me. As a fire marshal, I had been trained to recognize the signs of impending danger. But today, it wasn't fire or smoke I was worried about. It was the dark, the cold, and the lives at risk because of the HOA's decision. I began to realize that we couldn't just keep waiting. I had to do something. A real fight had begun, not just to protect my own home, but to protect my neighbors from the injustice they were facing. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about being left in the dark. It was about what we had allowed to happen, the HOA using its power to control us without regard for the lives it was endangering. I had to act. The battle had only just started. The situation that night escalated beyond mere inconvenience. A small flicker in the distance caught my eye as I stood in front of my house, my flashlight cutting through the pitch-black street. At first, I thought it might be a candle or a flashlight, but then I saw the smoke rising into the air. My stomach dropped. It was coming from Eleanor's house. Eleanor James, an elderly widow who lived alone across the street from me, was already at serious risk. Her power had been cut off, and she was dependent on her oxygen machine for breathing. Now, as I saw the flickering flames climbing the back of her house, I realized the darkness had turned deadly. I was barefoot as I ran down the street, my flashlight now forgotten. My mind shifted into emergency mode. The kind of mode I hadn't experienced since my fire marshal days, where every second felt like an eternity and instincts kicked in. The fire at Eleanor's house wasn't some small spark. It was a full-fledged blaze, devouring the back of the house with an intensity I knew all too well. Her porch lights were out, of course. The power was still down. I screamed her name as I ran toward the side yard. The back gate was stuck, swollen with moisture, or maybe warped from the heat. I tried to shove it open, but it wouldn't budge. I kicked it once, twice, and on the third try, it finally burst inward. I didn't hesitate. I ran straight through the overgrown yard to the back of the house. The kitchen window glowed with fire, flames licking at the window panes. This wasn't an electrical fire. This was a grease fire, something that could have been easily contained with working smoke alarms or a functioning fire suppression system. But those systems were down, all because of the power shoot-off. Inside, I saw Eleanor's silhouette, hunched and confused, moving slowly as she tried to figure out what to do. She was standing there, frozen, her walker beside her but not in use. I didn't think, I just acted. I reached the screen door and banged on it, shouting her name. She didn't hear me. The heat inside was unbearable. I pulled my flannel shirt up over my mouth to filter out some of the smoke and backed up 3 steps. I threw my shoulder into the door. It cracked, but didn't open. I tried again, this time with more force. The lock snapped, and the door swung open. The heat hit me like a punch to the chest, but I didn't stop. I dropped to crouch and crawled low under the thick smoke. "Eleanor!" I shouted again, my voice rasping from the smoke. This time she turned toward me. Her eyes were wide, confused. She wasn't sure if I was real or a figment of her smoke-filled imagination. She was clutching her walker, but it was clear she wasn't able to move. "I've got you," I said, grabbing her and lifting her as gently as I could. She shook her head weakly. "I can't breathe. My oxygen." Her voice trailed off, and I knew we were running out of time. I picked her up, one arm under her knees, the other around her back, and I carried her out of the house. As we rushed through the hallway, I was careful not to knock her head against the smoke-filled corners. The fire was already collapsing in the kitchen, but I didn't look back. We burst through the front door, and I felt the fire surge behind us, something collapsing in the kitchen as we made our escape. Once we hit the street, I laid Eleanor down on the lawn, covering her with my own jacket. I checked her breathing, shallow but steady. Her chest rose and fell, but I knew she was in critical condition. She coughed weakly and blinked up at me. "You came back," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Always?" I said, my voice thick with emotion. And I meant it. The fire trucks arrived about 8 minutes later, too late to save the back half of the house, but just in time to stop the blaze from spreading further. The fire marshal, a guy named Roar who I used to train, nodded grimly at me when he saw the damage. "She's lucky you were there," he muttered. "She's lucky I wasn't asleep," I replied, but even as I said it, I knew the real tragedy had only just begun. The fire was the immediate crisis, but the deeper issue was the negligence that led to it. The cold, bureaucratic indifference of the HOA, which had put us all at risk without a second thought. The next steps would be even more crucial, but for now, the focus shifted to the aftermath of this disaster, the lives that had been changed and the fight that would surely follow. The next morning, as I walked back home, an indescribable feeling settled in my chest. It was a mixture of pain, sorrow, and resolve. This feeling, however, was more than just a reaction to the tragedy of the night. It was a deep, unwavering determination. I couldn't let things go on like this. The events of the previous night weren't just a regrettable accident, they were a failure of a system that was abusing its power, a system that had pushed families into harm's way just for a few extra bucks. I knew what I had to do. I had to confront Karen Langston. She couldn't continue hiding behind her authority. After everything that had happened, I wasn't going to let her apathy continue to affect our community. That afternoon, I went straight to Karen's office. She was sitting behind her desk, as if nothing unusual had happened. When I walked in, she looked up, showing no sign of worry or remorse. "Tom, what's this about?" Karen asked, her voice cold as always. "I'm here to talk about the power outage last night," I replied, my tone firm. "The whole block lost power with no warning. Can you explain that?" Karen didn't answer right away. Instead, she raised an eyebrow before responding, "We followed the procedure. Families who haven't paid their HOA fees have to face the consequences." I couldn't stand her indifference. "You can't treat people like this. It's winter, and many families rely on electricity to survive. You've endangered us, not just physically but emotionally as well." She remained unfazed. "I've already said. This is HOA policy. If you don't agree, you can bring it up at the next board meeting." I stood up, not saying another word, because I knew arguing with her would be a waste of time. But something inside me had changed. Karen didn't just cut off our power. She had severed our trust, something that couldn't be easily repaired. And I knew that if I didn't act now, things would only get worse. I walked out of her office, not just as an angry man, but as someone ready to fight for what we deserved. Not just for a peaceful neighborhood, but for a community that had the right to be respected, protected, and safe. Right then, I made a vow to myself. I wouldn't give up. I wouldn't let my neighborhood fall victim to the likes of Karen and her abuse of power. The days that followed were a blur of frustration, fear, and a growing sense of unity. The more I thought about the injustice that had been done, the more I realized that this was no longer just about me. It wasn't even just about the families whose lights had been turned off. It was about something deeper, the manipulation of power, the abuse of authority, and the fact that no one had stood up to it. Until now, I started reaching out to my neighbors, one by one. We needed to take action. The HOA had crossed a line, and we could no longer let them control our lives. It wasn't just about the electricity being cut off. It was about the principle. It was about the fact that they thought they could play with people's lives like this, without any repercussions. Ellie, Maria, Ed, and the others began to rally around the idea of taking legal action. We didn't have much in the way of resources, but we had something far more important, a community that was ready to fight. I knew the legal battle wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. We needed to show Karen and the HOA that there were consequences to their actions. We found a lawyer, Carla Nunez, a passionate and fearless attorney who had been fighting for tenant rights and community justice for years. She was immediately on board with our case, and together, we began to prepare for the long road ahead. The first thing Carla did was gather testimonies from everyone affected. Ellie shared the panic she felt when her mother's oxygen tank started running low, and Maria told the court how her toddler had developed a fever from the cold. He'd spoke about how his family had been forced to sit in the dark, not knowing if their home would be next. And I, of course, shared my own experience the night of the fire, the smoke-filled house, and the devastating consequences of a decision made without empathy. As we prepared for the trial, something remarkable happened. The more we spoke to each other, the stronger we became. We realized that together, we could make a difference. We weren't just a group of neighbors anymore, we were a movement. One day, as we met in my living room to go over the case, Ellie spoke up. "I never thought I'd be doing something like this. I never thought I'd be fighting against the HOA. But now that I'm in it, I can't stop. This is bigger than just us." Her words stuck with me. It wasn't just about us anymore. It was about sending a message. We couldn't let this kind of thing continue in our neighborhood or anywhere else. The courtroom, when the day came, was filled with tension. People from all over had come to hear our story. Reporters were there, and even some other HOA members from nearby neighborhoods. The case had become bigger than just Brook Ridge Summit. It was becoming a symbol of the fight against abuse of power. Carla started by presenting the case how the HOA's actions had violated both state laws and their own internal policies. She showed the board's emails, which outlined their strategy of targeting vocal homeowners and using power cut-offs as leverage to force compliance. As the evidence piled up, the room grew silent. It was clear to everyone that the HOA had overstepped. But the most powerful moment came when the victims of the blackout, our neighbors, took the stand. When Maria described the terror of watching her baby shiver in the cold, When Ed spoke about how he had fought for this country, only to now have to fight for his own home, the room was visibly moved. And when I took the stand, I told them about my brother Matthew, who died in a fire because of a lack of a working smoke detector. I told them that I couldn't, and wouldn't, let that happen to anyone else. The courtroom was silent. The weight of the testimony, the pain, the suffering, and the injustice was palpable. It wasn't just a fight for our rights anymore, it was a fight for human dignity. And then, in an unexpected twist, Karen herself took the stand. I had expected her to be cold, defensive, but there was something different about her this time. She seemed unsure, even a little rattled. The truth was starting to sink in. She had never imagined that her actions would be met with such resistance. In the end, the judge ruled in our favor. The HOA was found guilty of negligence, and they were ordered to pay $2.3 million in damages, a significant amount that would go toward compensating the victims of their actions. But more importantly, the court's decision sent a clear message: no one is above the law, and no community should ever be treated like this again. The victory wasn't just legal, it was moral. It was a reclaiming of our power, our voice, and our community. But the fight wasn't over yet. The next phase was just beginning, reforming the HOA, making sure nothing like this would ever happen again. Right after our legal victory, there was a palpable shift in the neighborhood. This feeling wasn't just one of legal triumph, it was a triumph of spirit. The unity and fierce resistance of our community had brought us a victory. But we knew that, as important as the legal win was, it wasn't enough. The HOA, though found guilty, could easily continue its cruel actions if we didn't act immediately to prevent that. We decided that we couldn't stop at just a lawsuit and damages. We had to change the structure of the HOA, eliminate the tyrannical rules and abuses of power that they had created. It was a daunting task, but I believe that only with this change could we protect our community from the dangers lurking ahead. A special meeting was held, not just to discuss the court's decision, but also to begin rebuilding the HOA in a more transparent way. Everyone in the neighborhood was involved. No longer were these meetings quiet affairs with just a handful of people attending. This time, we truly had a voice, and we weren't about to let anyone shut us down. Ellie proposed a public voting system for important HOA decisions. Maria suggested replacing the absurd fines with community support programs, like helping families who were struggling financially or offering assistance with home maintenance. These ideas weren't just responses to the HOA's actions, they were ways to build a genuinely fair and united community. We had changed. Our solidarity was so strong that we were able to overhaul an organization that had once manipulated our lives. One of the things I was most proud of was that we had started hosting monthly meetings, not to voice complaints, but to develop positive initiatives for our neighborhood. We created a community fund to help families in need and started small volunteer projects like building playgrounds for the kids and planting more greenery in the area. Most importantly, we regained our faith in ourselves. No one in Brookridge Summit felt powerless or suppressed anymore. Everyone understood that the power of the HOA could no longer dictate our lives without resistance. We were no longer pawns in their game. That day, when I stood on the stage at our first community meeting after the lawsuit, looking out at the familiar faces of my neighbors, I realized that the change had truly arrived. Our community hadn't just won a lawsuit, we had won back our sense of agency. We had become the ones who determined our own fate, and I was proud to be a part of that change. As I looked at the lights slowly coming back on in the neighborhood, I knew that our fight hadn't been in vain. This was just the beginning. As I looked at the lights slowly turning on in the neighborhood, I felt the rebirth of a place that had once been covered in darkness. The lights weren't just physical, they were symbols of recovery, hope, and a brighter future ahead. We had won, not by strength or power, but through unity, love, and resilience. We didn't just repair what was broken in the past, we built lasting values for the future. I no longer felt alone in this struggle. I saw all my neighbors, my companions in this fight, and I felt the strength and stability we had created. We were no longer just neighbors, we were a family, a community bound together. The feeling of freedom, peace, and trust in each other wasn't just something we had regained. It was a great gift we had built together. Now, I could sit on my porch, watching the glowing lights from the houses around, without feeling any fear. We hadn't just won against the HOA or the injustices before us. We had won against ourselves, conquered our fears, and learned to stand up for what's right. And when Eleanor returned to her new home, a house rebuilt from the ashes, she smiled, her warm smile and tearful eyes filled with gratitude. She looked at me and said, "We did it, Tom. We really did it." Those simple words carried tremendous power. They weren't just a thank you, but an affirmation that we had reclaimed what we truly deserved. In the end, we had built back not just a home, but a community, one where there was no fear, no oppression, and where each person could live freely and fully. The lights that now flickered on every evening were a testament to the strength of unity, to a community that stood up for each other, where no one was left behind. If you've ever felt overlooked, dismissed, or oppressed by those in power, remember you're not alone. Sometimes silence is the strongest form of resistance. Share your story in the comments. Your voice matters, and it could inspire someone else going through the same struggles to stand up for what's right. What time are you watching this? Where are you from? Let us know, and let's prove together that those who were once silenced can now speak loud and clear. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of hope, courage, and change. Because when we stand together, we can rebuild anything.